Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here on the fringe of the other university. Also, trying to tease you all a little bit. My subject is Renaissances. You will observe there are no illustrations and there is no screen, and I'm not going to excite you, a la Simon Sharma, by masturbating in front of various images. I really am not. What I want to do instead is to explore what seems to me to be the completely underestimated significance of the idea of Renaissance. I want to argue first that the very foundation of our culture, our Western culture, is the idea of Renaissance. That is to say, the engagement with the cultures of Greece and Rome. That is its foundation, much more than Christianity. The notion which is now pervaded by people like Tom Holland, that in particular our culture is based on Christianity, our political culture is based on Christianity, is quite simply manifest nonsense. Christianity is about divine revelation. There is no place for politics. Simple as that. The second thing that I want us to consider very seriously is not simply the idea of the Renaissance, the one we think of, the one in my own period. Again, as Dan kindly said, I'm a specialist in the history of the 15th and 16th centuries, which is the Renaissance. I want to suggest that our culture represents a continuous series of collisions with the ancient world. And that when the idea of that collision happening and being fruitful and being fructifying, and I want to explore the idea of being fruitful and fructifying in a moment, the essence of our culture goes. That is going to be my argument next week when I will talk about the death of the West, which is the product of modernism, which is a conscious and deliberate exercise following the First World War of the active repudiation of the past in all its forms, with, of course, most famously, the remark, which I'm sure all of you art freaks are fully familiar with, of Marcel Duchamp, the founder of Dadaism, that Rembrandt should be used as ironing boards. That's the moment that everything changes. And our political collapse of the 20th century, as usual, was heralded by an artistic collapse. It seems to me, generally speaking, that movements in the arts precede movements in politics. So that's going to be the overall arc of what I want to talk about. I will lay the foundations this week. I will, as it were, destroy them next week. But I also want to do something else. The other point that the other central issue that I want to talk about, and indeed it is the central issue, is that we need to register the Renaissance, which we tend to think of again as the arts, that we tend to think of as civilization, thanks to Kenneth Clark, as essentially variant forms of the fine arts. The vast omission in Kenneth Clark was politics. I believe passionately with Aristotle that politics is architectonic. It's the thing that gives shape. And it seems to me that the fundamental impact of the Renaissance, of course, vast in all the fine arts, in architecture and so on, but the fundamental impact is on politics. And then the final piece of heresy, because I'm very fond of heresy, remember all progress, and I'm that odd thing, I'm a progressive conservative, as Disraeli was. It's not that change shouldn't happen, it's how it happens, right? And so and dissent is absolutely essential, as of course Disraeli himself conspicuously demonstrates. But the other piece of heresy that I want to commit. Traditionally, when we talk of Renaissance or Renaissances, we focus on Italy with maybe a nod towards France. Remember the wonderful line of Matthew Arnold in one of his splendid political sonnets on France. France, mistress of all the arts, supreme in none. Seems to me it's a jolly good line. Matthew Arnold, in small patches, but not Sohrab and Rustum, is really rather splendid. But the missing place in our consideration of the Renaissance is England. I want to argue that the central impact of the Renaissance, especially in its broader cultural and political sense, is England. And that is the reason centrally that England, and again, let me put my cards completely on the table, is the central thread of Western civilization. This is where it happens, in the famous triangle of Oxford, Cambridge and London, but I'm ashamed to say it's largely London. Oxford and Cambridge play a nodding role at various points in this. They're the kind of backers in the band to the capital city. So that's the broad thesis that I want to explore. Let's just begin then with what is the peculiarity of Western civilization. It is its profound awareness that it is preceded by a superior one. In other words, Greece and Rome. Can we be absolutely clear on the nature of this supremacy? How long, and here a little bit of audience interaction, how long does it take before broad living standards catch up with what had been characteristic of the Roman world from about the 1st century AD to the end of the 4th century? Any guesses? The end 1800. It is 1800 years. If you look at the scale of the buildings of Rome and you compare the hovels, even with our great cathedrals, which are the only exception, there is some sort of sense, and they knew it. There is this proper sense of awareness that something great had gone before. And the Romans, of course, and this is what is even more peculiar, the Romans were aware of a greater civilization before them. Their cultural cringe, just like Oz is with us, their cultural cringe towards Greece and the Hellenistic world. So what you have then is our civilization has this astonishing, as it were, pre-story. A pre-story of from the about 500 BC through to about 400 AD, 1,000 years of this spectacular achievement in every single field. And of course, there are several links. There are things like ruins. We must not forget the extent to which the conquerors of Rome were awed by the remains of Rome. It's fascinating looking, for example, at the Venerable Bede in his, the first history of England, which is a history of the church in England, and at the sense of their incomprehending mystery faced with the great buildings. And remember, Roman Britain was deeply provincial. Dear me, was it on the edge of the known world? But those structures, which is why, for example, the coronation of the first king of all England, Edgar, doesn't take place in Westminster, doesn't exist, doesn't take place in London, it takes place in Bath, where there are still the greatest of the Roman remains. And there is a conscious invocation of those, along with the idea of empire, which again is that enormously important thing that's left hanging in the air. So their awareness of a past. And it seems to me that what I've described with Edgar at Bath is characteristic of the way in which what we conventionally call, and by the way, I think we should call the Dark Ages. I think the Dark Ages were pretty terrible. And all of these attempts of more or less sort of bearded anthropologists to persuade us that they weren't simply seem to me to be silly. One of the great problems is so much academic life has simply become silly. And because there is a refusal to engage in proper debate based on evidence, it remains as a form of childish silliness. And we need to challenge that silliness. The Dark Ages were very dark and were very unpleasant and were very bloody. Yes, they produced some pretty jewelry at times, but dear me, that's not quite enough, dare one say. But the moments at which you see that emergence from the wreckage, the coronation of Charlemagne, it is an 800, Christmas 800. It is an absolutely deliberate revival. And it's accompanied, of course, with Alcuin, who is a direct line of descent, English in the direct line of descent from Bede. Remember, it is very difficult for us to remember that, but for a period of the 6th century, 6th and indeed 7th century, the intellectual centre of Europe is the Tyne. Now, this is very yarrow. It is very, very hard to believe that this be the case. It's a bit like making Hull city of culture, but there is this moment, and that moment, of course, is also itself. I've mentioned Bede and the sense of awe in front of the remains of the Roman world, but it's Bede who actually invents chronology, using the sequence of the annual appointment of Roman consuls. He realizes this is the only reliable index that you can use to establish a chronological sequence. It's an extraordinary achievement. And Alcuin is in that succession, feeding these ideas, what is being retrieved of the Roman world in terms of culture and so on, into the court of Charlemagne and those ideas. Now, of course, I've left out one hugely important thing, haven't I? There is a direct line of connection, and that is the papacy in its imperial aspect. That is arguably, there's a thread that links it directly to that world. But again, of course, it's important, I think, that we get the thread in the proper perspective. One of my favorite quotations, again, is Thomas Hobbes on the papacy. Are you familiar with it? The ghost of the Roman Empire sitting crowned upon the dunghill thereof, which seems to me to be a spectacularly accurate description of the imperial papacy. Remember, you have two popes at the height of the Renaissance, one called Alexander and the other called Julius, the Emperor Alexander and Julius Caesar, to the lamentations of Erasmus. And that so the papacy as that conscious thread, not in its Christian aspect, but in its Roman aspect. Church law heavily based on Roman law. The invocation of the actual titles, Pontifex. I mean, can you imagine a Christian bishop calling himself Pontifex Maximus? When you think of what the Pontifex Maximus had done, it's that immense sense of the prestige of that world and acting as a direct line and communication. And of course, I would acknowledge that in that sense, the church does act as a not very effective custodian of that inheritance. So the point, so I've already made one, I think, significant statement. There's not one Renaissance, there are renaissances. And what always used to be seen as a problem with the idea of Renaissance, actually, in other words, you can't just talk about why do you talk about the Renaissance of the 16th century when there was one in the 12th and there was another one in the 8th and 9th, is actually, providing you understand it's a plural phenomenon, is actually the very strength of the idea. So at each stage, then, of this slow recovery, there is a re-engagement with the Greco-Roman past. But what do we mean by that re-engagement? After all, we are told now in this wonderful age of modernity that the past is old-fashioned and stuffy, and to engage with the past restricts creativity and all the rest of it. One of the best ways of exploring what I mean by Renaissance, I mean, remember, the term itself in the form is not a contemporary term. In other words, if we look at the Renaissance of the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries, for example, they don't talk, there's no direct talk of Renaissance. If you look at the man who was most conscious in the use of words and language at this period, who is the great international Latinist, the Dutch scholar Erasmus, he talks about an idea of ad fontes, back to the sources. It's the idea of the source and the purity of the sources. You will then see, when you're almost at the end of the process as far as the fine arts are concerned, at the end of the 16th century, with Vasari in Italy, who is, remember, he's the man who invents the notion of art, as we are all familiar with it. He's an awful lot to answer for, complete with idolizing the lives of painters who, remember, most of the time were regarded as third-rate artisans. It's very important we get this point right. It begins to shift in the 16th century, but even in the age of Van Dyck, even in the age of Charles I and knighting Sir Peter Paul Rubens and indeed Sir Anthony Van Dyck, the price of a Van Dyck is £50, which is the same as the price of a pair of second-hand diamond earrings for the Queen. So that gives you an idea of the relative status of these things. Anyway, it's Vasari who comes up with the basic idea of a rebirth. But it doesn't become an abstract noun until the French and then the Italians, and more particularly the Germans in the form of Burckhardt and whatever, get their hands on it in the 19th century. But I think there's a better way of looking at it, and that's to go right to the beginning of the process. What is it that actually shifts in the Renaissance? What shifts in the Renaissance of the 14th, 15th and 16th centuries? I think it's a moment in about 1345 in Italy, in a monastery, when Petrarch, Francesco Petrarch, the man that we think of mainly as a poet, one of the prime sources of Shakespeare and of those dreadful courtly love games of the late Middle Ages. It's when he opens a manuscript and he starts reading the letters of Atticus, or rather the letters to Atticus, Cicero's letters to his intimate friend. And what they do, they're not philosophy. They're not works of great abstraction. They're not works of political invocation, like or reports of aggressive speeches, like so much of Cicero's output. They're an account of civilized life, written, dictated in the heat of the moment, recording. There's a most wonderful series of letters, for example, about a work that unfortunately has disappeared, though we know a lot about it, and is going to be central to my theme of the political aspect of the Renaissance, and that is Cicero's De Republica. We've lost the work. Only bits of it were recovered at the beginning of the 19th century. A section survives in the form of the Dream of Scipio. But what's extraordinary is, thanks to the letters of Atticus, you can follow the process of writing. And as a writer myself, am I familiar with it? The last chapter went quite well, but I've come up with a most awful problem. I really cannot see my way around this. I went for a walk in the garden. I came back. I had a drink. And you think, this is... He thought this is 1,300 years ago. This is a life I recognize. This is a world I can penetrate and understand. And that stony face of the Greco-Roman world suddenly collapses at that point, and it becomes knowable. And the energy of why did Erasmus want to go back to the sources? How was he able? Because remember, there's another great point. We think of the survival of a manuscript as, there's this, when we may actually find them, thanks to the papyri in the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum. But we think of, quite wrongly, of the survival as a manuscript as the survival of something that Cicero handled. It does not exist. It's a product of multiple transcription. And every time you transcribe, you introduce error. And what Erasmus was about, following on from that moment of engagement in Petrarch, was using that sense of liveliness, what I would call a sense of total history, a knowledge of everything, of the dress, the coinage, the art, the architecture. You can cut back through the veil of obscurity and mistranscription and get to the thing itself. Get back to the original. Now that, ladies and gentlemen, can be an exercise of mere freezing, can't it? You could be going, and indeed that's what happens to Latin as a result of that, from being this lively, living language. When you're determined to go back exactly as it was when Cicero, it stops developing. French did exactly the same thing to itself with the Academy under Louis XIV. French freezes. Literary French freezes exactly at the moment that literary English is exploding. So it can be dead. This idea of Renaissance can kill. The idea of purism and purity can kill. But what's extraordinary is an Englishman. Remember, England. What is England at this point? In other words, the contemporaries of Petrarch. It's the 14th century. We're in the middle, of course, of doing rather well at biffing the French in the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. But the thing you've got to remember is England is part of Greater France in terms of culture, with this peculiar survival of a peasant dialect of what's left of Anglo-Saxon when it loses all its grammar, which is why we're so fortunate not to have a declining language with declensions and conjugations and all that kind of thing, and instead to depend on idiom, which is why no foreigner can ever learn it fully. Right? You have to be born into it. What happens is, of course, in this strange little offshore island, the first stage of what I regard as the central aspect of the Renaissance is fully understood. You see, I think what it's about is not simply rediscovery, it's rebirth, it's cultural fusion. We are a society, dare to utter the word, based on cultural appropriation. And it's no accident that this has become the great no-no. It's again part of the repudiation of what is the nature of our culture. Now, why is England peculiarly able to do this? Why does it feature in this? What am I arguing for its centrality? Well, here I will make one concession to the left. It's because we're mongrels. And because, above all, we have a mongrel language. English is a fusion of French and English in the 14th century with heavy admixtures of Latin and Greek in the 16th. It is a new language. Can we all register this fact? English is a new language. When you came to debate the translations of the Bible in the 16th century, and debate, ladies and gentlemen, is a very gentle word for the agitations that went on over the subject. One of the points that was made by Bishop Gardiner, by Stephen Gardiner, who, although he may be a reactionary, is one of the brightest men of the early 16th century. He says it is entirely inappropriate to put the scripture, which is, as he then thought, the unalterable word of God, in English, because English is an unstable language. It is still in the processes of formation. And he, of course, is absolutely right. So this sense of mongrality, of the mongrelization, in other words, the way in which the culture of the ancient world isn't just revived, it transmutes. There's a fructifying process, and this very idea of fructification forms the center of the very first northern reaction to what's going on in Italy, who is by, of course, the man who actually invents English. English is a language, to a quite unusual extent, invented by a single man called Geoffrey Chaucer. And Chaucer really shapes a language. He lays much more than the foundations. By the time you've got to the Tudor period, Chaucer is actually understood as what? He is understood as the English Virgil or the English Homer. They see him as the founder text of a language. And Chaucer Very remarkable chap. He's like many of us. He's rapidly sociably mobile, upwardly mobile. Not many of us, though, were going to leave a granddaughter who's a duchess. But anyway, duchesses won't exist. But Chaucer's granddaughter becomes the Duchess of Suffolk, and is buried in splendour quite near here at Ulm. All go and have a look at her. Anyway, part of his process of being upwardly mobile was being a diplomat as well as poet and all the rest of it. And he goes to Italy. He probably meets Petrarch, and he understands in the most extraordinary way, as only a poet, as only a creative can, what is actually going on. The opening of the poem is a direct and brilliant translation of the Horatian line, ars longa vita brevis, life is short, but art is hard work. Brilliant translation of that. And then he has this line which describes what I mean. Well, actually, it's a quatrain, 4 lines, which describe exactly what I mean by a Renaissance. As the English of that period is a bit difficult, I'll do a very quick summary. He says, just as each year, it plays on the words old and new, which of course is exactly what we're talking about. Just as each year from the old cold fields spring new corn, so from old books new science comes. It's an extraordinary idea. You see what I mean? It's the idea that the past is not constricting, that the past is not limiting, that the past isn't just there. It's something that talks to you and fructifies. In other words, what Chaucer does again is glimpse what I would argue is the central idea of our civilization, that there are things called classics. That's to say, texts that you constantly return to because they have something new to say to generation after generation. That it's a process by which, however much it may seem stale, however much the binding is frayed, however long the dust has accumulated on the shelf, it suddenly, as you're reading it, revitalizes. It explodes in the mind. And you can see right at the beginning, Chaucer understands that. And it seems to me to be really, I would argue, it's that quatrain should be the foundation text of our culture. It's what has been unique about Western culture, and particularly the culture here in this strange little corner of northwestern Europe. Now, why am I making all of these claims for England, apart from the fact that I enjoy teasing the French? As you know, one of my favourite lines is that all bad ideas are French, all good ideas are English. Now, what is the reason for this, apart from the fact that England and France really are the missing halves of a perfect civilization? And they will never be united. But why am I making these claims as opposed to merely teasing? And I'm making them seriously as well as teasingly. By the way, I think humour is an essential part of seriousness. It's only solemnity that excludes humour. Humour is the best way to communicate. It's also, of course, that product of what is the essential process of creativity, which is the clash of conflicting and irreconcilable ideas. The various forms of humour and wit are all this awkward juxtaposition in which what are normally the ball bearings in the mind suddenly develop corners and strike off against each other and spark and clash and lock. That's what goes on. What is that process of sparking and locking that I think takes place here in these islands? As we go forward into, indeed, as we move forward from that Petrarchan moment with the discovery of the letters of Atticus, what essentially the texts that become, as it were, the must-read texts of the 15th century are very different from the texts that the earlier Middle Ages had been interested in. The early Middle Ages had been interested in legal texts, it had been interested in philosophic texts, it had been interested in medical texts, it had been interested in mathematical texts. Remember, the original programme of Oxford and Cambridge was a severely practical one, either for training in the church or for the learned professions of law, medicine, and so on. This notion that you spent all your time musing is very much a sort of late 18th when it was port, and 19th when it was scholarship, invention. There's a remarkable change from the Petrarchan period onwards in what you become interested in are essentially the political texts of this culture. Essentially and supremely the works of Cicero and the historians Livy, Polybius, and all the rest of it. And it's this, it seems to me, that sparks a quite peculiar reaction in Europe, first in Italy, and then much more particularly and much more excitingly in Europe. The broad thrust is, of course, that Cicero is talking about essentially in things like De Officiis, duties, and in the broad bulk of his works, of an educational program that is derived from essentially the educational programs pioneered in the Athenian Academy and so on, which becomes, by the time you've got to Cicero, training in rhetoric. That is the persuasive speech that you employ in a society with open politics and open justice. Rome conducts its politics when it's not murdering each other, which is a very important part, as in Scotland, of that process of conducting politics. It conducts it in the Senate by debate. Law courts are in public in the forum and are pleaded before various forms of juries, and this intensely verbal culture. But at the heart of the verbal culture is not simply the art of persuasion, it is the art of persuasion to the proper involvement of the citizen in politics. That the natural destiny, the proper destiny of the free man, hence the liberal arts, from the word for freedom, is engagement in politics. Now, there's a tiny little problem, isn't there, that in most of Europe, there was not much encouragement to engagement in politics, as Europe consisted of monarchies, frequently of a rather bloody description. However, of course, in Italy, there were surviving republics, and it's there that you begin what's called civic humanism, in which these ideas are reworked into programs of political engagement, activity, notions of the responsibility of the citizen to the state, the idea of the commonwealth, of your duty to society, and all the rest of it. And historians like Hans Baron got terribly excited about all of this, but of course it's total dead end. What happens to the Italian city-states? Apart from Venice, every single one of them fails. It's a total dead end. End of the scholarship, apparently. What has not been thought about is the dissemination of this in the world of monarchies, the world of Northern Europe. Well, some historians did try to think about it. Historians like J.A. Pocock and Quentin Skinner argued that there was what's called a Machiavellian moment. This is not the Machiavelli of the Prince, but the Machiavelli of the Discorsi. When Machiavelli is doing what? He's reflecting on the dialogues of Livy. He's reflecting on the histories of Livy, the great Roman historian. And when Machiavelli explains what he's doing, he gives 200 years later a very similar version to what we get in Chaucer. What Machiavelli says, what I am doing is incorporating my own extensive experience of current affairs with my deep knowledge of the past literature. It's exactly that same idea. And what you get, argued by Pocock and by Skinner, is you get a Machiavellian moment in which parts of the governing class at various times, and indeed members not of the governing class of Northern Europe, waken up to the idea of the citizen, of political participation, in other words, to republicanism. And that this is, in other words, things like the English Civil War of the 17th century and all the rest are to be explained in this light. Actually, this seems to me to be another total dead end. There are no, apart from a handful of fanatics like Milton, however great a poet he might have been, he was certainly a fanatic, a handful of fanatics like Milton, there are no republicans in the middle of the 17th century. The argument of the Civil War is not an argument between monarchists and republicans. It is an argument, as the case of Edward Hyde demonstrates very clearly, it's a debate between two different views of monarchy, one of which is kingship under the law, and the other is the idea that the king enjoys superiority to the law in one form or another. It's a debate between those two things. So are we then left with the notion that this wonderful range of political ideas of the ancient world doesn't really have much of an impact in this world of royal courts? Well, it'd be very odd, wouldn't it, to draw that conclusion, because again, arguing against Holland, have you noticed our entire political vocabulary does not come from the Bible? It comes from Greece and Rome, doesn't it? Democracy, aristocracy, the monarchy. These are all Greek words. Our entire political vocabulary is the vocabulary that was totally familiar to Cicero, Polybius, Livy, and all the rest of them. So how does it get to us? Where does it come in? Why does it become so significant? Well, the short answer is that historians have not looked at how you make ideas palatable. This would surprise nobody, and I was very pleased that Dan dared to mention that I was a popular historian once upon a time. And I remember colleagues, particularly in this university, sneering at the word. It's amazing, isn't it, how the word people can be pronounced with that infinite, that kind of elegance of disdain, heightened by a good glass of sauterne, and fruit upon the. Anyway, as I pointed out, it was better to be an unpopular, better to be a popular historian than an unpopular one. Anyway, so I know a bit about how you make ideas popular. And the key figure in all of this, and the key figure in why this comes home to England in a most extraordinary way, is a North Italian called Baldassare Castiglione and the Book of the Courtier. And what Castiglione does in the Book of the Courtier is to take all those Ciceronic ideas and to say, well, actually, you know what, chaps, it's jolly useful if you know how to persuade your prince. You might get a bit more in your back pocket. And he turns it into a kind of early version of PPE. How do you manipulate those in charge to deliver what you want and to get as much loot as possible? And of course, like PPE, it's dressed up in all sorts of grand language. But essentially, it's how you win the favour of the prince. Right. Now, this may seem that I am being simply frivolous. Well, I am and I'm not. Because the earliest impact of Castiglione north of the Alps is in England. Curiously, he's actually imported in the Italian by, of all people, Thomas Cromwell. There's no evidence that Cromwell led Machiavelli. He was fascinated by Castiglione. But much more importantly, a decade earlier, you get a man called Sir Thomas Eliot writing a book. I said Castiglione's book is called The Book of the Courtier. Eliot's book, directly copied, is called The Book of the Governor. That's the member of the English ruling class. And the other peculiar thing, and this again is something that my fellow scholars have never bothered to think about, the other thing that's very striking, if you look at the world of the Machiavelli, if you look at the world of the classical republicanism, if you look at the world of the civic humanism, it's terribly high-minded. It's all about words. In Castiglione, in Eliot, you get something else. You get the face of gentlemanly activity. Suddenly, you put together all this Ciceronian language about public service with being a good chap, recognising honour, getting off with the ladies, that call courtly love and whatever, writing poetry, being good at sport. In other words, what happens in the works of Eliot is you come up with a package that combines high culture with sport, a sound mind in a sound body. And I think that what happens, in fact, I am certain that what happens is, partly by pure luck, Castiglione via Eliot invents the idea of the English gentleman. This combination, I suppose the last parody of it is Boris Johnson. You know, the final, and I mean, seriously, I mean, and he's the kind of graveyard of all of these things that I'm talking about, the classicist and all the rest, you know, the emphasis on words and whatever. But at its beginning, it was something completely different. It offered a unique model of education incorporating serious knowledge, first of Latin and then of Greek, which was palatable to an aristocratic culture. And you know what? It coincides with another wonderful moment in which you're completely transforming the purpose of Oxford and Cambridge from being clerical training schools into the elite kind of institutions that we have now. And the result is that in England, in, for example, complete contrast to France, you incorporate this extraordinary pattern of Renaissance culture into the political education of the upper class. And it seems to me that the staggering shift of political ideas, writing, whatever, in England and indeed English politics is fundamentally due to this. Because again, we've got to put another central thing into place. England, again, in one sense, I describe it as this quaint little provincial island. In another sense, England had been extraordinarily precocious because from the reign of Henry I and Henry II, the two great lawgiver kings, England, uniquely in Europe, develops a system of systematic law that rivals Roman law and develops its own political culture, which you will see formulating itself brilliantly in the works and the governance of forgive me, the governance of England by Sir John Fortescue in the late 15th century. And the peculiarity about the governance of England is that it attaches, this, remember, is something written about 1470. It judges government by freedom, law, and public prosperity. And it does it again by comparing the English monarchy to the French monarchy and arguing that the French monarchy is an absolute monarchy and is oppressive because of the king's absolute right to enforce tax, whereas the English monarchy, where you require consent to tax, well, you only pay tax if the governing class want to pay tax. And broadly speaking, he is right. But he does something extraordinary. He actually compares things like the existence of torture in the two countries. He discusses levels of public prosperity, what goes into the typical cooking pot of the typical peasant. This is 1470. It's a quite extraordinarily radical way of looking at it. But what it also incorporates is a view that the English monarchy had a peculiar constitution, and I want to emphasize that word, that the English monarchy had a peculiar constitution which made it not a simple monarchy. He talks of it as a dominium politicum et regale, that word, politics. It's a monarchy that requires argument, that requires persuasion, okay? But the idea again of a constitution. Now, it seems to me that what this does again means that those ideas which are purveyed by Cicero, that begin with Cicero, that are disseminated through Castiglione and through Eliot and so on, have another effect. The Romans had a profoundly self-conscious awareness of why they were great. Can we all be quite clear about this? They knew it was their army, but they also knew something else. It was the structure of their constitution. And the De Republica is a hymn to that constitution. What is quite astonishing is that the English start to apply exactly those arguments to their own constitution and to present an argument that the Constitution of England, which of course is inherited and is not the subject of abstract reason, nevertheless incorporates reason, incorporates political habits which lead to good behavior, and again there's another way in which this all fits in very neatly. It's again the idea of the developing idea of what constitutes a great language. Their awareness that a language has to have a form of grammar. It has to have a form of it has to have forms of regularity. So in exactly the same way, they come to see that a state needs the equivalent of a grammar, which is a constitution, that it needs a structure by which it operates. And it's this idea which is one of the great areas of debate in the 16th century, and it takes us, and I will in a second now stop because I've been going on a little bit too long, again it takes us to a framing debate. The end of the Roman world, the direct response to the sack of Rome in 410, which is, remember, the beginning of the end. The response to the sack of Rome of 410 is one of the great works of Christian literature. It's Augustine's City of God. And in Augustine's City of God, he argues that Rome fell because it was corrupt. It was an unjust society. What then happens is, in the 16th century, with all of this debate on constitutions, on what constitutes proper politics, you get an intense debate. Is England Rome in the good sense, or is it the bad sense? Is it a corrupt society that should fall because it doesn't have, interesting word, justice? It's an unjust, are you all getting certain echoes? It's an unjust society, you know. What we want is social justice. That, you know, is the standard authentic Christian position, and it is what is purveyed by one of the greatest works of the 16th century, either literally or it may be ironically, one can debate this, by Utopia. This is what the first book of Utopia is about, the demonstration that England is an unjust society, and that the second book offers a vision without Christianity. Again, Nat Con, listen, without Christianity of the just society. And what that does, and it's quite remarkable, and this has not been spotted before, it triggers a debate in England. Are we a just society or are we not? Are we Rome in its good aspect or are we Rome in its bad aspect? And you can see, going through a whole series of thinkers, the first answer to More is within a few years of Utopia. It's again in Eliot. More's argument that we were an unjust society is actually based on a bad English translation of the word res publica. He translates it with the usual English phrase, common weal, which is why he's able to say that because everything isn't in common, therefore it's unjust in it. It's very important to remember that Thomas More would have been entirely at home in momentum. We've at least one aspect of Thomas More. Hitler Day would certainly be. Hitler Day is a member of Momentum. Anyway, it's an unjust society. Eliot comes up with the brilliant riposte. Actually, that's a very bad translation. The Roman, the Latin, isn't common thing, it's public thing. Res publica. And he then advances this very sophisticated argument that the English constitution represents the proper balance of the Aristotelian polity, of monarchy, aristocracy, and commonality. And then you can see my collateral ancestor, Thomas Starkey, debates exactly the same issue in his dialogue of Lupset and Poole, which I'm always rather fond of, but I shouldn't be because it's never published. So really, it's an obscure thing that lurks between Thomas Starkey and Thomas Cromwell, which is a rather unequal debate, I have to say. Not sure even I could have won that one. But anyway, again, there you get a very different view of how the English polity needs to be reformed, with a kind of aristocratic revival, but again based on a very serious knowledge of English history. And it goes right through the 16th century until the work on which I want to end, which is the astonishing work of Sir Thomas Smith, which has got the title De Republica Anglorum. You'll all be relieved to know it's actually in English. But what it amounts to is a detailed blow-by-blow account of the English constitution, which begins by saying, I'm not going to deal with feigned commonwealths like Plato and Thomas More. I'm going to talk about the real thing. I'm going to talk about England now in 1569, and it's as good as anywhere else, and it works. completely, straightforwardly positivist view of England, but also incorporating all those senses that I was talking about of the legitimacy that's explained so convincingly by Fortescue. And this, you see, is the way I want us to end. I want to end within this wonderful city. Every time I come to Oxford, I'm just struck by its beauty, the astonishing beauty. Because what you have, think about it, you have, once we've come out of these edge boulevards, which you all know what a boulevard is. The boulevard is something that was built over the fortifications of a city. These were the town ditches, which is why there's lots of space. Then when you go there towards the High, you're suddenly in this intensely cramped medieval world. Go down to Merton and all the rest of it. And then suddenly, across the road, in the middle of it all, there's the Camera and the Sheldonian, and you're in the Roman Forum. You're in a world that consciously fuses the two together. In exactly the same way at Burghley, you fuse together the classical architecture and the Gothic inheritance. In exactly the same way that the ruling English aristocracy of the 18th century drape themselves in togas, build Roman palaces, apply Roman discipline to their army and their navy, which includes them too, and see themselves as the equivalent of that Roman world. And indeed they were. Thank you.
David, first of all, David, thank you so much for your remarkable talk. I was just commenting to Patrick, you just have this amazing knack for being able to express in such eloquent and captivating terms centuries of history with a remarkable thesis behind it. I think it's an extraordinary talent, and I commend you for it. My question is this. You posit a series of renaissances taking place over a number of centuries, not just simply the one that we generally consider to be the Renaissance, and of course, all hearkening back to the classical period, the Hellenistic period, and the Roman period, the Naissances, if you want to call them that. But these are periods defined by eras of rejuvenation, of ideas, of letters, of arts, of prosperity, punctuated by periods around them of darkness, the Dark Ages and Middle Ages, etc. What were the common qualities amongst these series of Renaissances that led to them happening at those places and those times when they weren't happening elsewhere? Because it strikes me, we want to live in an era of prosperity. We want to live in an era of great ideas. We want to live in an era of security and wonderful arts. We should have more of that. So what can we look at for those brief periods when these things happened that we think are the common factors that led them happening in those places and times?
God, I wish I knew the answer. It's a fascinating question. And again, I have lots of disagreements with Quentin Skinner, but he has this wonderfully pompous and pretentious phrase, which is nevertheless important: concatenation of circumstance. Things happen to come together. And it's very difficult, I think, to provide a kind of etiology. It's really very, very difficult. I mean, who again would have predicted England? You know, and the circumstances of North Italy and England. And I suppose one could hazard one guess. They seem to be societies that have, if you like, essentially a non-absolutist view of authority. Now, where do you fit Charlemagne into that? Clearly, a king who nevertheless saw that government had to be more than simply slashing and burning. There is that appetite for rules that we are strange creatures. We need rules, but rules can kill. And it's this what is so extraordinary, I think, about all of these periods. There are exercises, if you like, of self-conscious limitation. You're going back to a root source, but at the same time, it fructifies. So and again, I would argue that one of the reasons for the extraordinary is how long you can keep it going. Most of them are very short. What happened in England is, of course, that it incorporated itself in institutions. Now, but then, of course, institutions die and fossilize. And what we've seen is precisely the institutions that gave birth to this now strangling in it. So it's not a very helpful answer, and it's a rather confused one, but it's the best I can do.
Wonderful, Max.
Can I just make one other point? Our civilization is such a peculiar one that it has renaissances which don't depend on the classical world. I would argue that Romanticism is a medieval renaissance, and it had exactly the same sort of fructifying effect that I'm talking about. The 19th century reaction to the 18th is very complete re-engagement with the Middle Ages in its art, its architecture, its thought, and whatever. And again, it's very important that we understand again that their awareness, as the ancient Romans were aware, that they have foundation legends about their city, but they don't have the sort of legends which the Greeks do, and maybe there will be many very much better classicists here, I'm sure, than I am. They don't have legends that their laws were handed down to them in a package. They have a very clear view that it's an organic process. Latterly, of course, it isn't. When you get the codification of Roman law, it's the work of a single emperor and a single Justinian and a single group of jurists. And one of the things that I think is most striking about this world that I'm talking about is awareness that it's organic. And again, if you look at the way in which this England, which I've said, is one that prioritizes notions like freedom, it doesn't see them as being the result of a single act. It doesn't see them as a result of a series of abstract arguments. It sees them, on the contrary, as an inheritance precisely from the Middle Ages, which is why in the 1830s, when the Palace of Westminster burns out, you deliberately rebuild it in a Gothic style. It's why when the Canadians, who of course exist within the system of English common law and a parliamentary constitution, when they build their new parliament building in Ottawa, they build Gothic. Even the Australian parliament has got vague Gothic echoes. And it's, again, the Hungarian, when they're trying to reinvent the notion with the Golden Bull, it's complete nonsense, of course, but the Golden Bull being the equivalent of Magna Carta. So this peculiar engagement with a past which is seen as, if you like, sounding mystical, a kind of source of reason.
Hello, David. Hello, David. You said at the start that all the Renaissances are preceded by an artistic Renaissance, yes?
Yeah.
So given that I think we're in an age of, a lot of, with the changes in technology and the last quarter century in Britain and the West of, popularization of art and new forms of art coming along, can we be optimistic and look forward to another uplifting Renaissance in the near future?
I'm afraid I regard most of what passes for art now as its antithesis. When Duchamp presented himself at that exhibition in New York, at which the urinal was first exhibited, he called himself an artist, as in anarchist, an un-artist. Duchamp, and I'll be talking about this quite a lot next week, is only invented as an artist again in the mercenary world of Milan in the 1960s and New York in the 1960s, when the modern art, which begins as a movement of destruction, then takes over things like the Royal Academy and all the rest of it and presents itself as heart. And I think that it's the antithesis of what earlier centuries would have understood by it. No, I'm afraid I draw a very different conclusion. I think that now it may be, and you will all have noticed one gigantic omission from what I've been talking about. I know nothing about mathematics. I know nothing about mathematics. Now, no. I am not boasting of my ignorance. It's the only reason I'm not a scientist. When I was a schoolboy, my best subjects were physics and chemistry. History was very much an also-ran, but I wasn't a natural mathematician. Sadly, I'll be going to the funeral of one of my schoolmates who was tomorrow, and that was why I took the wise decision to become an easy subject like history instead of a genuinely hard subject like physics or maths. Now, it may be that what's going on in high tech at the moment will create something different. And what I think is interesting is the way in which people like Peter Thiel and others are doing something rather remarkable. They're recognizing that they've actually got to go back and understand earlier political traditions, and that sort of silly, hang out, the glottal stop world of California and Tony Blair is suddenly now looking very, very passé. It's looking very passé indeed. And I think, because again, what is very clear is this new world depends on two things. It depends on freedom. It depends on astonishing ability to do utterly novel things. But it also depends on a very, very precise understanding of immensely complex mathematical rules. And it is this doubleness that seems to me to be so significant. But no, I am not optimistic. We seem to me to be in this position that we have had. We are, without any doubt, and I'll be spending a week with friends who are at the forefront of this. We have enjoyed completely, as opposed to all the Greta Thunbergs and all the rest of it in this world. We leave physically, medically, economically, the best lives that any human beings have ever led anywhere. Full stop. Without any possible question or doubt. On the other hand, the sense of aimlessness, of formlessness, of pointlessness is overwhelming, which you could say is pretty much Rome 410. Ooh. Sorry to run away. Of course, understood.
Hello. I'll ask a question from behind you. Can you see me okay?
I'm being taken from the rear.
Wouldn't be the first time, I guess.
Yeah.
Anyway. Hello, I was very curious about your reference to the dream of Scipio. Mm-hmm. Because, of course, that's a text about that includes the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC in the Second Punic War. And we know now, from the our current vantage point, that Carthage was reconstituted in the Augustinian Revolution by the time of the end of the Second Sophistic. In the reign of Septimius Severus, it had become the second largest commercial port in Rome. But within the text that you referenced, it's just sort of a text of destruction. So are you suggesting that the proper constitution of a republic requires sort of building on the ashes of what's past? Is that the idea?
No, I think that what the analogy is that Carthage was seen rhetorically as the antithesis of everything that Rome stood for. In exactly the same way that in the great age of Britain in the 18th century, France is the antithesis of everything that's English. Do we all know why the words "Britons never, never shall be slaves" appear in Rule Britannia? It is absolutely nothing to do with the darker coloured inhabitants of the American colonies. It's the French because the French are the subjects of an absolute monarchy. So France is this extraordinary struggle of empire of the 18th century, in which France is Carthage, England's. Am I not? You're the 18th century. Am I not right? Absolutely. This is what it is. And the again, this inane notion that the 18th century empire was by accident. I mean, just preposterous. It is the product of, at least among certain circles. I mean, if you look at the circles around Pitt the Elder and whatever, of the Townsend and whatever, the most radical, vehement, organized drive deliberately modeled on Rome. But at the same time, it was incorporating all sorts of ideas very, very quickly that little things like, bizarrely enough, conquest and freedom were closely associated with each other. Again, one of the things we completely failed to understand. The City of London will no doubt be tearing down the great monuments in the Guildhall, particularly to William Beckford, because, of course, William Beckford, this is the father of the Beckford of Fonthill, who goes very much in a taking from the rear direction, as we all know. But his father was the great radical and great merchant, and, of course, great slaver. I mean, great West Indian merchant in London. Why does he have the monument in Guildhall? Because he is the preeminent supporter of Wilkes. In other words, it's the radicals who back empire. And this seems to me again to be something which is very, very Roman in its origins. So empires, and again, we do need to understand this. The extraordinary explosion of 18th century England following union with Scotland, following the quelling of the subsiding of party strife, the abandonment of impeachment and its hideous penalties for political failure. This explosion of 18th century England, late 17th, 18th century England, it's the foundation of the modern world. The Enlightenment is not French. The French Enlightenment is simply the English Enlightenment in fancy dress and, Voltaire's parading, and then the horrors of and then the horrors of Rousseau and whatever. But that change, which is embodied in Westminster Abbey, you go in the Abbey, and what other country has a mathematician at the heart of its national shrine? Newton is one half of the great screen of the Abbey, the Kent screen of the Abbey. They are aware. Go and look at the ceiling in the best exposition of the nature of 18th century empire is the Thornhill ceiling at Greenwich. It is absolutely astonishing. It is a hymn to empire as progress. As progress in the arts of science, navigation, the George III giving the prize for longitude and all of that sort of stuff. There's this extraordinary explosion, but empire is at the heart of it, as you would expect from a culture which is based on Rome. Heaven's sake.
We've got time for two more, one of which is here.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk. You said quite rightly that Romans understood law, they understood their army. Something else they understood was spectacle and the power of ceremony. Now, throughout your talk, the way in which you spoke of politics, and you alluded to the work of Pocock and Skinner, was very much a very familiar one about laws, about constitutions, the distribution of sovereignty. That's obviously been the stock in trade of their academic careers. What I'd like to submit to you, though, is that there are aspects of the political that can't be captured just by talking about laws and constitutions, and that's why I talk about the Roman understanding of ceremony and ritual. In the context of England and England's history, and this is why I'd maybe like to do the heretical thing, which is to sort of maybe try and challenge your argument a little, is that we have rituals
I believe
and
in debate.
we have rituals and ceremonies in our history, and I would submit to you that they are overridingly descendant from Christianity. So, for example, I'll give you some examples, and then I'll obviously let you respond. Many of us watched the coronation last year. Our kings are anointed by priests. They're not anointed by ministers. During medieval and early modern times, the number one ceremony that people engaged in, at least once a month, once a week for many people was the Mass in its Catholic and then its post-Reformation Protestant Lord's Supper form, an act of collective worship, of ritual. So there's a heretical challenge there and an observation that maybe I'd like you to expand on your overall argument.
Lovely. Right, let's look at the last coronation and let's look at what was peculiar about it. I think King Charles is a catastrophe. The coronation, not only is it eco-lunacy, but well, he's the third in terms of his numeration. Let me explain why. The coronation was an absurdity. It emphasized, as you say correctly, the religious aspect. Indeed, all references to power were eliminated from the text of the service. That coronation service was the most heavily edited text of the coronation since Edgar. Normally, what happened was it called the benediction of God on power. The very idea of power and politics was deliberately removed from it as an act of shocking connivance between Welby and Charles. And the result is what, ladies and gentlemen? How were we supposed to be ruled? By love. The coronation service was early Beatles. Now, this is something radically not the case before. Let me describe the first coronation. Let me challenge you by describing the first coronation after the Glorious Revolution, the coronation of William and Mary. The thing that was so striking about the coronation of Charles was the elimination of the political class. If you go back to the coronation of William and Mary, they deliberately build a gallery directly, the way the coronation service works in Westminster Abbey. By the way, I'm one of the pioneers of an understanding of ceremony in England. So I love that question, I especially when there's a little tweak at the tail, which one can then respond by a bit of stamping. The Abbey is designed for the coronation. You've got the great crossing in the middle, which is technically known as the theatre. Then at the back you have the extraordinary apse which centres on the shrine of Edward the Confessor, and you have the cosmati pavement on which the actual coronation takes place, and you have the surrounding tomb chests of the great medieval monarchs. So in contrast with the French, where the king is buried and where he's crowned is different, it's the same place. It's the actual, it was originally the sanctuary place. But when you came for the coronation of 1689, you completely cover the northern half of the sanctuary with a huge gallery. And whom do you put in it? The entire House of Commons, headed by the Speaker. You then have William and Mary insisting they don't actually want a coronation because they think it's a load of old popish nonsense, but they are persuaded to go ahead with it. But you then get Bishop Burnet delivering a sermon, which is a piece of pure political propaganda. It begins, "We experience the turmoil of revolution. On the other side of the channel, there is the monstrosity of absolute monarchy. Now, thanks to their gracious sovereigns, we are in," they didn't actually use a Goldilocks situation, but what he wanted to say, we're in a Goldilocks political situation. In other words, it was totally political. And it's Charles who's broken that with, I think, absolutely disastrous consequences. If we go back to the religion in England, the reason that we've been able to deal with religion in England is, thank God, Henry VIII nationalised the church, which means that the decisive body until the Church of England was foolishly given synodical independence was Parliament. This is why we don't have religious fanaticism in England, because we're a soundly Erastian country. That's to say, the state governs the church, which is a very good thing. The only moment that we toy with the horror of Scotland, which is indeed the dominance of politics by religion, and you can see the consequences of that in modern Scotland now, it is when you get the Presbyterian system of John Knox imposed. There's a brief moment when, with the victory of the Scots over the royal armies at the beginning of the Civil War, and the resulting victory, the early victory of the Long Parliament over Charles. The peace settlement with Scotland involves the imposition of Presbyterianism on England. And the Scots chief negotiator is a man called Robert Leslie. And Robert Leslie writes back to the Lords of the Congregation in Scotland and says, don't be bluffed. What we've got here, it's wonderful, is a lame Erastian presbytery. The English upper class won't get a lot of uppity, stupid priests to run religion. And that's, of course, what happens to Laud. So again, you see, I think we need to also to understand the way in which the entire structures, you're very much right, for example, royal ceremony until 1688, even with the Reformation, is essentially religious. You keep the main, the Chapel Royal keeps the main calendar of saints' days and all the rest of it. And indeed, until the accession of William and Mary, the Chapel Royal remains the main centre for the training of musicians and all the rest. It stops. There's an absolute knife goes straight through it. And you then get a complete reinvention of royal ceremony and royal public ceremony in the 18th century. You get things like birthdays and whatever, which, remember, the Middle Ages don't celebrate birthdays because being born into this world's a horrible experience, so you don't. It's only heathens who celebrate birthdays. But you start celebrating royal birthdays. You've drawing rooms and all this sort of stuff. But more interestingly and more importantly, you develop a new repertory of public ceremony. Things like the royal. With Handel as being the musician powering it, so you get the royal fireworks, you get the you get the water music. Above all, you get two things: you get the music for the wonderful music with breaking all the rules of the 18th century, the most extravagant use to that point of drums and timpani for Zadok the priest being the great one for the coronation of George II, and then it's Handel's oratorios, which are the war hymns of the British Empire. And it's Handel Handel and all of this stuff that becomes the dominant text. He becomes, he's the triumph of the will of the 18th century British state. And it's a centenary of Handel, which is the most extraordinary thing. The centenary of Shakespeare, despite, all Garrick's best efforts, is a kind of, well, it's very typical. It's a sort of wet summer's afternoon in Stratford and nobody goes. Handel's centenary, they turn Westminster Abbey the wrong way round. The royal family the royal family, by the way, pay their obeisance to Handel's grave. That's how it begins. And they are then given a royal pew with their backs to the screen. And the entire West End is created into this vast tableau, a hymn to music with a sort of special organ with about 400 pipes. Choir. We think of gigantic choirs as 19th century. There were 400. And the whole thing is sort of repeat performances of See the Conquering Hero Comes and the Messiah. King of Kings and Lord of Lords. I remember listening to that in King's College Chapel just after the fellows in their wisdom had removed the only Christian symbol from the altar. There you are in a building which is a hymn to the Tudor monarchy, with all of the absolute vulgarity of John Saltmarsh putting light bulbs inside the Tudor crowns. As you go round, King of Kings and Lord of Lords and glowing crowns all round the place. So the 18th century invents a new language, a new ceremonial language of monarchy, which is intensely political, intensely imperial, and novel, and by the way, violently Protestant.
In Elizabeth's coronation, what was political about that then?
The coronation of Elizabeth Elizabeth II. Well, the presence of, first of all, the entire body of the peers, the entire body of the House of Commons. The prayers are different. I mean, if you actually compare the texts of the two coronations, you will see. I mean, the prayers at the coronation of Elizabeth are the old prayers. They pray for guidance. They talk about power. I mean, the symbolism of things was altered in the coronation. There was this ludicrous business. The glove, right? The glove was handed over to the monarch traditionally by the Lord of the Manor of Worksop. Unfortunately, the Lord of the Manor of Worksop is now a limited liability company, so he couldn't hand over. And instead, they invent this completely new thing. This is the glove that moderates the power of the sword. You know, I mean, you're just the most absurd. Well, no, but the notion of the sword of justice was completely eliminated from the coronation text. I mean, it's really, I mean, I haven't written about this, I really should, but the entire text was butchered to present the notion that government is about love. It's Yoko Ono, you know, I mean, well, yeah, yes, but sorry, Jesus only worked when he was married to Rome. Jesus offers no view of politics. So if you have divine revelation, this is why the idea of Christianity supplying the basis of politics is absurd. Divine revelation doesn't have argument. How can it? How can it? Politics isn't about being nice to people. It's about choice of between scarce resources like economics. And it's exactly our refusal to make those choices that leads to our present crisis. You know, I'm sorry. You can't rule. You can't. Not even a family can be ruled by love. Forgive me for getting cross, but you know, there's a large smile on my face. Yeah, and we're all being decent and civilized. And you know, I believe in passionate disagreement, but there should be a smile. There should be friendship. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, forgive me. Sorry.